Okay, so let's start. Hello. Good afternoon. Let's get this session started with the third lecture by Cailin.
Great. I think everyone in this room should congratulate themselves after 2 weeks of having knowledge shoved into your brain, 6 to 8 talks a day. Here you are at the penultimate talk, still kicking. So this is building off the framework that I discussed in the previous 2 lectures. I think it's kind of a fun topic. We can just go at whatever pace and get as far as we do. Fairness and signaling. Oh, no, the animations are still not working. Let me just look and see. Well, they won't, which will be a little weird in a few places, but we'll just do it. Okay, so we saw this modeling work showing how categorical inequity can emerge through cultural interaction. And one of the big points of that, especially in the initial lecture, was that having social categories fundamentally facilitates the emergence of inequity, that it creates these equilibria that wouldn't exist if you didn't have social categories, and that those equilibria are kind of representations of what happens when we have discrimination or prejudice. Now, in the models I've talked to this point, it's just been universally assumed that everyone has clear identifiable tags or markers that signal their identity. So when 2 actors interact, they can immediately and easily perceive the tag of the other actor and then use it to condition their strategy towards that actor. But of course, in reality, when we talk about the actual things that act as tags or markers in these kinds of systems, things are not always so clear. And in addition, identity categories are not static entities. So it's both the case that you can't always just easily observe tags and use them to categorize people into groups. And also it's the case that over time, some types of tags adopt and change. So to make this point, let's talk about the different types of tags or markers that we use to identify or signal our identity. Normally, this would be animations. We get one at a time. So let me think about the order. Okay, so there are phenotypic markers, mostly innate phenotypic markers, though some of them can be changed, that we use as markers of race. So things like skin color, but then also some other phenotypic features like hair color or hair texture or whatever. There are innate sex differences, so things about biological sexed bodies that act as tags or markers. There are clothing differences that we use as tags or markers to identify things like social class and also other identity categories. So sometimes people will wear a literal uniform for their job, and often the function of that is to signal to others that this person is in that category. This person is a police officer, or this person is a ticket person who you can go talk to or whatever. We have things like accents and languages, which are learned. They're not innate the way things like skin color or sex differences are. But once they're learned, we have this period of flexibility and then a period of relative inflexibility where it's harder to change your accent and harder to change your languages. These often act as tags of things like ethnic identity, but also things like class. We have religious dress and symbolism and iconography. So sometimes people adopt garments that signal their religious identity. Also other things like jewelry might. We have things like tattoos, which are kind of interesting in their flexibility properties. They're easy to get, but very hard to remove. And they're often used as signals of group identity, sometimes for things where people have to commit to a group, like a gang, but also sometimes ethnic identity, like in the case of the Maori. And then last, another thing that sometimes acts as a tag are things like manners and behavior. So if we think about like upper class manners, sometimes these are developed as a type of tag that tells something about your group identity and how people should treat you. They're much more flexible than something like your hair color, but they are not always totally easy to adopt. It's not like everyone can just have the manners of an upper class person in some systems. So we can see right away that different tags are different from each other, especially when we think about how observable they are and how much they can be adapted or changed. So we see many different types of properties across these different types of identity tags. Okay, so motivating questions for this work. How do the properties of identity markers or tags interact with the emergence of unfairness? So I argued that these kinds of tags have to be in place to have unfair systems emerging and being stable. What happens when we start varying these tags or letting them evolve on their own? How might they culturally evolve as a result? So when we have interacting systems, the emergence of bargaining and the emergence of signaling your identity, what do we see happening? And then last, can tags be used as a way to disrupt inequity? So if we take the point of view of wanting to undermine an inequitable system, what role could tags play in doing that? So these are going to be the motivating questions for the rest of the talk. Yeah.
I'm always confused with this. Is there a very strict definition of what culture means? Or it's vague all the time?
Yeah, so is there a strict definition of culture? I would not say so. But what I have in mind here are basically behavioral variants for humans that could have been otherwise in some sense. So there's going to be some parts of human behavior that really aren't cultural, like us falling asleep every night. But then a lot of the other stuff we're doing, anything you can look at and see cross-cultural variety is going to be part of culture. And also I have in mind things that are getting accumulated and adapted via the process of social interaction. Anything else? Okay.
But this ability to learn some cultural stuff, that is usually considered probably genetic.
Yes, our ability to learn cultural things, yes, genetic. So there's going to be innate features of us as a species that allow us to have culture. And some other species can have, on the type of definition of culture I'm thinking of, there are other species that can have a little bit of culture because they can have learned variants that are going to be passed on and that are different from group to group and could be otherwise, like killer whales, some primates. Good. So let me give the answers to these questions right now. Here's the things I'm going to argue. In order to support inequitable systems, tags have to carry enough information. And I mean this in like the information theoretic sense. They have to predict your group membership with a high enough probability. And I won't go too much into the details, but in our paper, we talk about this a little more. Second argument, for this reason, over cultural evolutionary time, you see tags with the right properties getting selected and developed to facilitate inequity. So it's not an accident that we don't use ear size to ground an inequitable system. We pick the tags that have the properties that are going to carry information about a group in a way that we can build an inequitable system on top of. When I say we, I mean humans, not like, I'm not trying to do this. And then last, I'll argue that messing with identity markers can help disrupt these systems, though it's not the own, like you shouldn't do it on its own, but it can be part of disrupting these systems. So that's where we'll go. I'll just quickly mention the papers this work is coming from. So this paper, Fairness in Signaling and Bargaining Games, it was actually first written by my co-authors, Mihaela Popa-Wyatt, Roland Muhlenburn, and Jeremy Wyatt. So they developed some of the models you'll see today first without me. And then in this paper on the stability of racial capitalism, Femi Taiwo and Nathan Gabriel and Liam Bright and I use those models and develop them to make some arguments that we'll see today. And then they were having trouble publishing this paper. So I was like, do you want me to just be your co-author? And they were like, okay. So I just invited myself to the party on this paper. This is to say the stuff you're seeing argued like has many authors. So credit them in your heads appropriately. All right, so first I have like bargaining models and inequity. I'll go through this very quickly and skip some of the slides because this is the stuff we saw in the first lecture. Then I'll present two models, one where we make the tags flexible, meaning that people can purposefully or accidentally change their tags so they can adapt their tags over time as a cultural evolutionary process. And another one where we make the tags more or less observable, where when you see a tag, you can correctly identify group membership with greater or lower probability. And then we'll see what those changes do to inequity in these systems. Then I'll make the sort of remaining two arguments, one about why we pick certain tags and one about messing with tags to improve equity. All right. So again, we're thinking about these very simple bargaining games, these mini games where we have 3 strategies, low, medium, and high demands, and then 3 equilibria, 2 of which we can think of as unfair, 1 of which we can think of as fair because it perfectly divides a resource. Here you can see I use slightly different payoffs than in the other slides, but it doesn't matter. Also, we're going to be using this representation of power that I introduced on Monday, where power is represented by what you get if bargaining fails. And so a powerful group is going to be a group that if they and another individual overdemand a resource, they get a relatively good payoff. A less powerful group, if they and another individual overdemand a resource, they get a poor payoff. So far, everyone remembers this, or any questions? Okay. Then we're going to be representing cultural evolutionary processes. Again, groups with tags will be varying how the tags work. They're going to start off in all the models I'll talk about, initialized with random strategies. I'll always be talking about simulation models in this paper because once you start filling with the tags, you really have to do simulations. Analytical treatments of these models get much more complicated. So we're going to be talking about agent-based models that are simulated where we give the agents random strategies, then they interact and play the bargaining game. And then I'm going to talk about the actual particular agent-based dynamics we used in all these papers. It's different from the ones I've talked about before, but it's basically at its heart similar in that you're imitating things that are working well for other group members. So same kind of setup. Any questions about this? Okay. So they're going to have tags, arbitrary visible markers. The model is going to look something like this. We'll have 2 groups. I'm going to show you variations on how the tags work. Here they have their random strategies. So the dynamic we'll use throughout this is what's called pairwise proportional imitation dynamics. So what you do in this dynamic is for each agent, you calculate like an expected payoff for them given the current state of the group. So here we'll say if we're focused on their outgroup interactions and evolution, for this agent, we just pair them with every individual in the other group, and we give them payoffs based on their pairings, and we just add it up. And we do that for everyone, and they all have a payoff. That's their payoff given the current state. So that's the first thing that happens in a round of simulation. Then the next thing that happens is some agents are randomly selected, and they have a random cultural model selected. So this is someone they might imitate. So perhaps that is these 2 are paired and these 2 are paired for possible cultural imitation. Then if your model gets a higher payoff than you, so this model is getting a higher payoff and that's getting a higher payoff, you have some probability of imitating their strategy that's proportional to how much better they're doing than you. And I won't put up the formula, the details. Again, this is one of those cases where the details don't matter, but usually this is very typical in cultural imitation models. usually use some kind of curve that can be more or less steep that is going to yield for you the probability of imitation. So a bigger difference in payoffs will lead to a bigger difference in probability. And then if this is not very steep, you know, if it's like this, that difference doesn't matter as much. But if it's very steep, then you have kind of a cutoff where suddenly you're always imitating versus not. Yeah. The tags are the colors, yes. So we have the blue group and the black group here, exactly. Any questions on that dynamic or anything? Mm-hmm. Good. So in the base model, no, we assume in-group imitation only. But once we move to a variation of the model where they can start changing their tags, then yes, because the tags shape what you are perceived as. So we look at some variations of the model where, like, say this one moves to have a black tag, where they're still imitating as if they're part of the blue group. And that could have a cultural interpretation where it's like, maybe you have groups that live in different part of the cities and you're just imitating who's near you. And so even if you adopt a different tag, you're still part of that imitative group. But we also look at variations where, you know, if this person adopts a blue tag, suddenly the blues are imitating them and vice versa. But for now, in-group imitation. Yeah. Yes, y-axis is probability, x-axis is difference in payoffs between the two actors. So as your payoff gets more and more and more than mine, my probability of imitating goes up and up. Yeah, I mean, no, it's not. Yeah, so here maybe if you know, random agents get paired, some of them end up adopting new strategies. And what we find, and this won't surprise you, is that the equilibria of this model are the equilibria of the models that I've talked about before. You have to do slightly weird stuff with dynamics not to have that equilibria in this model, but so you have this group demands high and that one low, or this one low and that one high, or medium and medium. So you can have the two unfair demands or the fair demand coming out between the groups. All right. So that can represent discriminatory norms. I will drive home, and this should have been clear from previous stuff too. Without a tag system, inequity won't be stable. These social identity markers are acting as the symmetry breaker that allows these rules like blues get more. And this sets up a situation where once you get to one of these stable equilibria, if you're in the disadvantaged group, the best you can do for your payoffs is to be complicit in that discrimination. The best payoff you can get is to just go along with always demanding low and having them always take more from you. All right. Any questions on the basic setup before we get to like fiddling with the tags? Okay. Right now there's only one tag. We will vary that a bit, but mostly well, there's two tags. Mostly we'll focus on two tags, and then in, I think, one of the models, look at what happens when you can introduce more. Yeah. Yeah, two tags in the sense that there's two completely arbitrary visible markers of some sort. Yeah. In the model, obviously, it's like 0 and 1 somewhere in your little agent matrix that identifies you. Okay, so we're going to look at a series of models where we have two groups. We're going to assume that one is more powerful than the other, and I'll make that power difference as much as I can without disrupting the sort of payoff structure of the game. So the disagreement point can't go higher than that low payoff without changing the equilibria of the game. But I'll just make one as powerful as it can be. So I put their disagreement point up very close to low. And then we start looking at different ways the tags could be flexible. So the first thing we did is said, what if we just add random mutation? There's nothing systematic in the way agents experiment or adapt tags. It's just that sometimes with a very low probability, at the beginning of a round of simulation, a random agent is selected and they mutate their tag to the other tag. So that looks like just for no reason, that agent just flips to the black tag. Then the next thing we added was the idea that actors could purposefully imitate successful tags from an in-group member. So if an in-group member has experimented and flipped to a new tag, when you do your imitation, we look at your payoff, you look at my payoff, yours is higher. I do this, I choose to imitate you. I don't just imitate your strategy, I also adopt your tag. So if this agent pairs with that one and that one's doing well, then they update to have the same outgroup tag. So those are the first two variations we look at. And when we do that, we find it dramatically decreases the amount of unfairness or discrimination in this model. Now, as soon as we start fiddling with these tags, the outcomes are not the strict equilibria that I described before, because we're going to start disrupting those equilibria as we allow them to change tags. So what we did to measure outcomes in this model was measured proportion of discrimination. And what we mean by that is we pair every actor, given their current strategy, with every other actor, and then calculate what proportion of the time is someone going to be discriminating against that other pair, one demanding high against the other demanding low, in particular, that pairing. So it's a little bit of a clunky measure. The other thing we do is look at payoff for the different groups, like what payoff are they getting on average at the end of simulation. Yeah. Yes. So in these first models I'm showing you, the group structure does still matter because it's shaping imitation. So they're still always imitating within group, even if they flip tags, which is a little weird. Like we had to pick it one way or the other, and you could have done either one. But yeah.
And thanks. Is tag switching cost-free?
It's cost-free. Yeah, of course we could add costs, and if we made them high enough, you know, it might do something. I mean, we'd have to put it in maybe at the imitation decision moment, like you're getting a better payoff than I am, but if I...
Yeah, but that was for actions, and then for tags, is there a different...
Well, the point is if we were gonna add costs to tags, we'd have to add it somewhere into the dynamics. So I was saying, if we wanted to add it, we could add it at that imitation step at something like, am I going to adopt? I have to think my payoff will be significantly higher or something.
Right, because I was confused, like, I mean, as an individual, would it be very clear is if the difference in payoffs is due to actions or tags? And then and that's a cost, like getting that information or something.
In this, right, in this model, that's going to be all bound up together because your tag is shaping what your payoff, what your strategy is doing for you, right? Like both the tag, how you're perceived, and the strategy you play jointly together will determine your payoff with another individual, whether they treat you as in-group or out-group, and thus which strategy they play for you. We could have done it where it was like, you know, the pairing is between groups with tags, and you calculate the payoff to the group that has that tag versus the group that doesn't, and then you decide based on that. So we could have done something like that to try to separate out the influence of tags, but it would move us away from the interpretation of like, I'm picking a cultural model. Yeah. You'll see as soon as we start fiddling with this stuff, it's like the number of choices you can make in the model starts ballooning. There's like 20 ways you could do it. Yeah. Sylvia? Yeah.
Yes, just a clarification. When you have imitation of tags, then you allow people with one tag to interact with people of another tag, which you don't before. I'm not sure I understood how this update goes.
Yeah, I should have been clearer about that. I was showing the part where you calculate your outgroup payoff, but in fact, we have them interact with outgroup and in-group and get a total payoff, and then just imitate from in-group. Okay. The switching of tags is symmetric in that both groups can mutate and switch. So given the power difference between the groups, as we'll see shortly, they don't do it symmetrically because of the way the evolution is usually going. Yeah, Kartika.
So being an in-group or an out-group is also a tag, right?
What do you mean?
So if a blue individual interacts with an out-group mutated blue individual,
Yes.
it knows that this is not an in-group person and behaves
No.
like it's an out-group.
Yeah, no, we say that like now that this individual has the black tag, these folks will deploy the in-group strategy with them.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, they'll deploy the my strategy against black tag, and they'll deploy the my strategy against black tag.
So,
So everyone will start treating them as that tag.
okay, okay.
So if we think of the strategy, like everyone has a strategy, in fact, that looks like this, you know, to make everything visible, and because usually I give these talks for philosophers, I suppress a lot of details. I just put their outgroup strategy, but in fact, their full strategy is strategy against blue, strategy against black. And so everyone's now treating this individual as having that tag and using that strategy against them. Is that helpful?
Yes. Also, culturally, what does this imply? Like, what would be a typical example?
Good. Yeah, so, you know, as I mentioned, we have all these different tags. Some are more or less flexible than others. And so what things could people actually change? In extreme cases, they can change their gender perception. So that's difficult. But we see that happening, that people, in fact, who are trans are sometimes like transition to a state where people start treating them as the gender they're signaling, basically. You see it a lot in things more like class, sometimes with things like religious group, where you can identify or you can adopt clothing or religious iconography or behaviors that signal class and start being treated in a different way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And as you know, I brought up before, the choice of like, should we have this individual keep like imitating within the group, or should they now be imitating within this group, was one where we were like, oh, no. But we kept it basically, the reason we picked in group instead of doing now they imitate within tag was because that makes it harder for this disruption to disrupt inequity. So we basically set it up to the harder version of the model for the tag flipping to break the inequitable system. Because the point was that tag flipping can break it, and so if we make it a little harder rather than a little easier, we make the point better. Okay, so here's results for this. Here what we did was I mentioned a lot of the results will just make the disagreement point high for the powerful group, but here we actually varied it. In the model, the base model with no mutation, how often do we end up with these discriminatory pairings with one demanding high and one low? In this version of the model, that happens about 25% of the time, and then it becomes more as that powerful group becomes more powerful. Once we add just mutation, just people randomly flipping tags, that drops off quite a bit, and we get about 8% of the time with a little bit of a power effect. And once they start randomly flipping tags and then imitating successful tags in their group, as well as successful strategies, we get basically no discriminatory behavior ever emerging in this model. So this supports this idea that flexibility in tags helps disrupt inequity in this type of model. It also decreases the expected payoffs for the powerful group. So here, again, we're increasing the power of the powerful group and looking at these 3 treatments: no mutation, random mutation, and then mutation and in-group imitation. And seeing how, like, what percentage of the pie does the powerful group get on average at the end of simulation. With no mutation, that power matters to them. They start getting more and more. When we add either of those types of flexibility, they get very little advantage from being powerful because we're not seeing the inequitable outcomes popping up in the model. In this, where the whole group is getting a higher and higher disagreement point. Everyone in that group, right, gets 30.3, which is right below the low in this. Okay. So oh yeah, cardigan. As we'll see in a minute, that's depending on what's happening with the strategy evolution, that is one thing that will happen. So if they're heading towards the 50-50 split already, you don't necessarily see outgroup tag imitation or flipping and then imitating outgroup tags. We've added mutations, so there's going to be random popping in and out of tags, but you won't see a systematic pattern where the less powerful group is imitating. If we have a powerful group and they're headed toward the unfair thing, you're going to see them imitating the tags of the powerful group. And I'll talk a little more about that in a second, like show what happens when we allow just one group flexibility. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, say it again. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we didn't do a version of the model. So I talked about how we had done this agent-based model where we made just one individual powerful. We didn't explicitly do that here, but I would think it should be the same. I mean, it's basically the same model with a slightly different dynamic. Certainly in the no mutation, like just the base model, that should happen. All right, the last thing we looked at is actors just copying outgroup tags. So now sometimes when they do imitation, they do it from the outgroup. And if that individual is getting a higher payoff, they copy their tag. And that also completely eliminated discriminatory outcomes in the model. So no outgroup imitation. This was just for a slightly different version of payoffs and things. We see this sort of increasing proportion of discrimination. We add outgroup copying. It happens 1% of the time when people copy. And now we can't have inequity anymore. Yeah. I can't remember. Did they copy just the tag or the outgroup strategy? I can't remember what we did. My instinct tells me just tag, but I'm not sure. All right, so basically what's happening in these models is that this kind of flexibility is destroying correlations that otherwise start to emerge between tag and strategy. So in the other models we're talking about, you end up with this correlation where this tag, if you see that tag, you can totally predict that person's about to demand low or that person's about to demand high. So you can develop these social rules that are very like information carrying. You have tag X and therefore I can safely take advantage of you. Or you have tag Y, therefore you're going to make a high demand of me. And so it stops identity from acting as a coordination mechanism for inequity. It prevents us from reaching those anti-coordination outcomes in the bargaining game. And now the only stable outcome is the fair outcome where you don't have to have information about the other player to reach equilibria there. Yeah. Yeah. With the outgroup? As I said, I can't remember if it is, but I think it is. And I think it doesn't matter that much probably because, you know, like the outgroup imitation is happening pretty rarely. It's only 1% of the imitative pairings are with outgroup. And so whether they copy strategy or not probably doesn't matter because then they'll have pairings within their own group many more times. But yes, they still do the same imitation dynamics. Anywhere in these models, it's the same imitation dynamics where the greater your payoff is than mine, the more the likelihood of imitation. All right, so this responds to some of the comments coming up. In these models, it matters who has tag flexibility. So if we only make the powerful group able to adapt their tags, what happens is they still will keep separate tags for the most part, and then there will be this disambiguation. Now they can disambiguate a low power group that they can take advantage of. And we see discrimination emerging usually. When we allow the less powerful group to adapt to switch tags, then you see the disruption of inequity. So that's the place where it matters that someone's able to change their tags. Oh, I thought I had a figure for that. So yeah, basically the way we did these models is it was identical to the ones I just described, but we only allow this group, say, to do outgroup tag imitation, or we only allow this group to do outgroup tag imitation. And if I had put the figure up, you could see that allowing the less powerful group to do it would make a much bigger impact on how much discrimination you see coming out in the model. And furthermore, what you see are these outcomes where that group has totally adopted the signal of the powerful group. So you end up with like a group where the tags are the same or very similar, depending on if we have mutation happening, and everyone has adopted a signal of the group that otherwise would have ended up demanding high more often. All right, so that's the flexibility part. Any questions or thoughts at this point? Yeah, Sylvia? And, yeah.
Signaling, I don't know, that you are rich. That's not a tag that would be available to the poor. So it seems that depending on the nature of the tag, you might have different possibilities.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, and I think that's a big part of the insight here is that not all tags will work the same and some will be much more flexible than others. And I think in fact, what you often do see is powerful groups choosing tags that will disambiguate them from a less powerful group. So picking clothes that people simply can't afford or developing an accent that you have to start learning from when you're a very small child and otherwise you can't imitate it, or even having things that are like almost dog whistle level signals. So like in some places, the upper class will wear clothes that are very expensive, but that are like tattered. And it's a signal that like, I've had these clothes forever. And that is something that you can only pick up if you're part of that class, right? And so, yes, you often see the powerful group shaping tags in the right way.
Yeah, also, in the previous slide, you mentioned that the reason this works is because flexibility it removes the correlation. So here, if you actually quantify the correlation between the tag and the action that you perform, is it drop to zero or is it just drop below a certain threshold that removes inequality?
Yeah, you don't have to have the correlation drop to zero. You just have to have it drop a bit. And we'll see that when we talk about unreliable tags as well. Actually, in those models, relatively modest drops in the information content of the tag disrupt the equilibria, these unfair equilibria, because it suddenly starts to not pay off for you to risk getting the disagreement point.
Okay.
So what we do in the paper is talk about like this decorrelation and like show like you can calculate how much information a particular tag is carrying about group identity. And over the course of the base models, you see those tags or about strategy, predicted strategy. You see those tags coming to carry more and more information about predicted strategy, whereas here they can't undergo that process of coming to carry information about predictive strategy. Because once you start to have the unfair outcome, people are going to be incentivized to switch their tag.
Right. Oh.
All right, so let's talk about observable tags. So some tags are more or less observable. And what we mean by this is that for some tags, there's a greater chance of mistaking an individual's tag for another one. And what we find again is that when they're not reliable or observable in this sense, they can't underpin inequitable systems. So an example here might be like age tags. When you try to guess, like age is always a primary category, and it's basically always used to coordinate behavior in every society. But sometimes you mess it up. You know, sometimes you think someone's a child and they're actually an adult. So we were talking about that earlier. It was a big part of my young adulthood. And sometimes you think someone is about your age, but in fact they're 20 years older and you should have been respectful, and vice versa, right? Sometimes you think someone's, yeah. So you get it wrong sometimes. There can be other kinds of tags similarly that you observe most of the time, but not always. If we talk about societies where you have like multiracial societies, it's often a phenomenon that people will project a race onto another person that may or may not be correct. And sometimes they'll be very certain and they'll use that to coordinate how they treat them. But in fact, that person is racially ambiguous. Yes.
Okay, so age is interesting though, because everything we've learned about tags, you're talking about how, if you have a given quality in quotes, you would like to signal it very clearly to someone else, to say, oh, I am, this particular quality, and therefore you should treat me accordingly. But age, I don't think we quite signal it the same way as we signal some of these other tags.
Well, I think in a lot of these cases, you wouldn't want to clearly signal your tags if you're just talking about incentives. I mean, if you are in a disadvantaged class, you do not necessarily want to signal that that's the case. I think the real reason age is interesting, I mean, in some places it acts as a marker for dividing resources, bargaining. In a lot of places it doesn't because of the relationships between older and younger generations. One thing that's interesting and different about it, which is something I haven't really gotten into in any of these models yet, is that it's not coming in any sort of binary. It's coming in a continuum. And so the way you would model that in this sort of situation is that this would be your strategy, not against blue and black, but against perceived younger and perceived older. So everyone has a downward directed and an upward directed strategy. You can also do that to model things like colorist societies like Brazil, where there aren't clear racial categories, but there are color gradients. Or maybe like India. Okay. Yeah.
This is just, at this point, I'm just like sharing.
Okay. Go on.
This reminded me in the north of India, there's a lot of caste discrimination that occurs, and a very surefire way that people were able to understand what caste somebody was from their surname, because surnames used to hold that information about the caste of the individual. So a lot of lower castes, when the governments, when the country became independent, we got our own laws. Changing your name became a thing that anybody could do at any point of time. But still, there were these remedies that you could apply for if you were from a lower caste in order to get access to, say, government jobs, right? So a lot of individuals decided to change their surname to reflect Sharma, which was a very typical upper caste surname in the north. And what happened was, while they were able to sort of have certificates that allowed them to apply for lower caste benefits, they did not get the same treatment from people when speaking to them because they had the tag of the higher quality of higher caste.
It's okay, you're a terrible, you prejudiced, but go on.
Yeah, so it's sort of what happened. I mean, the inequity didn't sort of pass away. It's not like we've solved caste discrimination, just change your names. But it was sort of something where, at least within interactions, people wouldn't treat them differently.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually a wonderful example for this kind of phenomenon we're talking about, where you see the adoption of the like high status tag rather than the opposite, high status adopting the low status tag. Why would they? Like there are similar cases in the US. So my grandmother's maiden name was Hanley, but her family name was O'Henley, and they just changed their name so it wouldn't be an Irish name, so that people wouldn't treat them Irish. All right, good. So what we do now in these models with unreliable tags is we have the two groups, still one is more powerful. We say when you observe a tag, there's always some probability you get it wrong. And for both groups, we range that from 0 to 1. So if it's 0, you're getting it wrong all the time. If it's 1, you're getting it wrong none of the time. We could have just gone from 50 to 1, but they did this part before I got there. Okay, so what this is showing is for this group, we'll say this is the blue group. When people observe their tags here, they get it right 100%, or they think they're blue 100% of the time. Here, they think they're blue 0% of the time. With the red group, we have the same thing. And what we find, this is showing the percentage of discriminatory behavior at the end of simulation, is that in these corners, where there's a high probability of disambiguating the two types, we get a lot of discrimination, and then that very quickly drops off as we move away from the corners. So as the probability of getting the tags right drops off, we get significantly less discrimination with every kind of step away from that. And here's a figure zooming in on that. So here we're just saying, okay, the powerful group will be 100% observable, and then we'll make the powerless group more or less observable. So this is upping the probability that they're seen as their outgroup rather than as themselves. So when we're over here, they're always seen as the powerless group. When we're over here, their tag is perceived as the same as the powerful group. And we look at the outcome where the powerful group gets more and the fair outcome, and we see the discriminatory outcome dropping off and the fair one rising and taking over as that difference happens. Yeah. I will, so if I am looking at you as this number goes up, this is my strategy against blue, this is my strategy against red. Down here, I'm always perceiving you as blue. Up here, I'm always perceiving you as red. In between, 50% of the time, I'm going to one or the other. Yeah, so I'm probabilistically getting your tag wrong. Yeah. Yeah, so here the, right, the blue, oh wait. Yeah, I can't remember, I'm getting turned around with the colors. But right, the less powerful group is being perceived incorrectly all the time. Yeah, so they're being seen as in group all the time by the other group. But I believe here it's still a little different from a single population model, because again, like I'm getting turned around on details because we had a lot of different variations in these papers. But I believe they can still treat the powerful group as outgroup if they want to, but usually they learn not to because we see the fair coming out. You'll see when we get here, we have this little thing where fair drops down. There are some kind of weird stable outcomes we get because of the sort of details of the model where things are unreliable, there's no real need to get into them, but like occasionally in these simulations, we get things that don't mimic any of the equilibria and mimic slightly different things, and it has to do with doing in-group imitation only. So even if everyone's treating each other as all part of one group, they're doing in-group imitation, and that creates sometimes artifactual outcomes. All right, so what we do in the racial capitalism paper is extend this model to one where we ask, if I'm a powerful group and I'm learning to pay attention to tags, to discriminate on the basis of tags, to pick tags to condition behavior on, how would I do that? And what we do is set it up so that the powerless group has two tags, one of which is very reliable, it always identifies them, another of which is not very reliable. So like we could think of these as being more like skin color and more like ear size or something like that. And then the powerful group is actually evolving, and they're doing the same pairwise proportional imitation dynamics to pay attention to one tag or the other. So ones paying attention to one tag may be doing better than ones who don't. So now the model looks something like this. Here's the powerful group. And then the less powerful group both has this dependable tag, and then they have another tag, which sometimes is seen by this group as in-group and sometimes as out-group. Does that make sense to people? Okay, and then what they're evolving to do, of course, they're all evolving the bargain, but they're also evolving. Now they have like a feature, which is, do I pay attention to this or do I pay attention to that? And so now if we thought about the powerful group strategy, it would look like this. It would have 3 parts. This part would be what you pay attention to. So maybe unreliable tag. This is like what I play against a perceived in-group member, what I play against a perceived out-group member. And so this part of the strategy determines what tag I'm looking at and if I see you as in-group or out-group on the basis of that. Questions? Okay. So we find powerful groups learning to ignore the unreliable tag more often. So here we're making that tag less and less reliable. So here you see them as outgroup 100% of the time, here only as 90% of the time. Notice we just do like little changes here, you know, just a couple percentage points in how often you see them as in-group. Then this is how often they end up focusing on the unreliable tag. So do they pay attention to the unreliable one? When it's actually still perfectly reliable, they pay attention to it half the time. Doesn't matter which one they pay attention to, they both identify outgroup. As it gets worse and worse at identifying outgroup, they stop evolving to pay attention to it as often. They start paying attention to the one that can identify outgroup. And this is more powerful. This is a stronger effect the more powerful they are. So down here is the most, these traces all track disagreement point for the powerful group. Down here is the one with the highest disagreement point. They're least likely to pay attention to that unreliable tag. And the reason is that they're the ones who are tending to head towards getting more. And so if they pay attention to the reliable tag, they can end up at that unfair equilibria. They have an incentive to pay attention to the reliable tag. Questions? Is this making sense to people? Yeah. Yeah. They just have one. Yeah. 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 Because it's perceived in and perceived out. So first I look at this tag or that tag. Then if I look at this one, I always perceive you as out. If I look at this one, I sometimes perceive you as in and sometimes perceive you as out. And then that determines which of these two I'll play against you. Always in group, yeah. Yeah, everyone can tell they're in-group members in this model. I think for these guys too, we make it so they always identify their in-group members. we don't have them evolve to pay attention to tags because we're trying to limit the number of things changing in the model. All right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, in this model, nobody's adopting any tags. The only things, yeah. Yeah. We're assuming fixed here. So they have fixed tags. It's just that one of them is easier to read. One of them, when you look at it, you can always tell who they are. One of them, you can't. You know, maybe one of them is accent, which is a little muddly or something. Basically, we could have done it so that they were also evolving to pay attention to their tags, but it was just, it creates kind of too much complexity in the model for my taste. So really the question we were asking is, in a situation where a group is tending to head towards that advantaged equilibrium, are they learning to discriminate their outgroup? Are they finding a way to pay attention to a discriminable tag? Yeah. 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 Yes. Yeah. It is asymmetric. Yeah. Because I mean, another thing we could ask is, suppose a powerless group is evolving to recognize or not recognize tags related to a powerful group. How would they evolve? But basically here the research question was about these like powerful groups and how they might evolve to look at particular tags, because this was in a paper about racial capitalism and the development of like racial categories along with colonialism, which I'll talk about in a minute if we get to it. Okay. So we found that in that model, we also did the same thing with flexible and inflexible tags and found that powerful groups would more often learn to attend to inflexible tags, so ones that couldn't be adapted over time. And so the general takeaway was that there are these incentives to create and pay attention to category systems, and that in this kind of model, you can see powerful groups attending to these incentives. All right, so like Jim, I will now make us do some philosophy. All right, so the theory of racial capitalism, this is a theory that explains why the global economy is capitalist and racially stratified, and it's mostly focused on areas of the globe which are post-colonial, post the European colonial expansion. And the argument is that during colonialism, you saw both types of organization being spread from Europe at the same time, which created this kind of contingent relationship between them. So if you go into details, their argument is like, pre-colonial period, you look at Europe, you see the emergence of capitalist systems. You also see these proto-racial organizations where they were creating these stable underclasses and kind of understanding them almost as racially different, though not exactly as racially different because they weren't. But the sort of class system in many ways was what they would call proto-racial. And then during the colonial system, you see this sort of expansion where now, rather than having a proto-racial division, you have a straight up racial division between upper class and lower class, where lower class is doing more work to produce goods in the system and the upper class is taking the rewards. Now, in addition, many argue that this didn't just accidentally spread during history, but that there's a functional relationship between race and capitalism, which is something like this. Capitalist systems are very inequitable, and if you have them, you need something to say why some people are getting so much more and some people are getting so much less. There's different ways that that gets justified, but race was something that very conveniently played this role during the colonial period. So this is the theory we were sort of interested in. And then we wanted to talk about it using these sorts of models. And so we asked, why would race, as opposed to some other type of feature or tag, be the thing that would be used to organize and justify inequality in a system like this? And the answer was that race, especially as it gets developed, will have the right properties to stabilize inequitable systems because it is relatively inflexible and because it's relatively easy to observe. So if we think about the models that I've presented, it's the type of thing where if you put that sort of tag in the model, you can get an inequitable system with the sort of high-low demands compared to some other tags which wouldn't carry enough information about group or strategy or whatever to get that inequality. So we argue that it sort of was the one that powerful groups picked out and then developed to be a marker of someone you could take advantage of. So the results, yeah, and this is just repeating myself, is that they were attending to these inflexible and observable tags. So by using tags like race, you can create a system that's inequitable to your advantage if you're a powerful group. And the argument there isn't that race isn't the only thing that could have done it, but that it happened to be a particularly convenient sort of tag to do it with. In addition, what we argue is that it's not just that race got selected to act as this kind of tag, but then it got culturally developed to have the right sorts of properties, again, to be more inflexible and more observable than it even would be naturally. So if you look, for example, at the American context, you have these rules like sumptuary laws and the one-drop rule that specifically function to decrease the flexibility and ambiguity of racial markers. So sumptuary laws were laws that specified how Black people could dress and wear their hair in the Americas. And the reason they were developed is that racially ambiguous people would sometimes try to use clothing, dress, hairstyle to increase their ambiguity, right? To perhaps be treated like a white person. And so these laws were passed saying you can't do that anymore. You have to wear particular styles of dress, particular hairstyles that increase the visibility of your race. The one-drop rule was a rule that was used in legal contexts in the US that wasn't specifically codified into law, but that said if anyone has even one drop of African blood, they count as Black. And the reason that rule became a popular rule was because you had many mixed-race children of slaves and slave owners. And that was a way to classify those mixed-race children as part of the stable underclass, right? So they're racially ambiguous. You develop a racial rule that puts them into the category Black and keeps them there. So in this way, we have these categories that they weren't just picked out, but then they're developed so that they are inflexible and so that they're more observable.
Racial capitalism, this would work only when there is enough racial diversity to cause this, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, in the US, the percentage of Black people compared to white people is actually very less, right?
Yes, but if you look at like the colonial period and during chattel slavery, you have a situation where this kind of racial rule isn't, it's not what people are using to navigate every type of division of resources. It's only being used in particular cases where you have that marker there. And then when you have that marker there, it's being used dramatically to like monitor division of resources. Does that make sense? So it's not that it's the organizing rule for the whole society, but it's the organizing rule across these groups.
Mm-hmm. And there's also like colonial ways where they sort of also do like an ethnic cleansing before they get into like they did it in Australia, they did it in the US. So like that wouldn't work, right? If you just remove the people to discriminate against, then there's nobody to discriminate.
Yeah. So I don't think in the colonial period, like it wasn't that the only thing they're trying to do is to have a stable capitalist underclass, right? They're also trying to open up whole areas where they can just steal that whole land. And so what's happening with like Aboriginal people in Australia, Native people in the Americas, is that a different sort of like goal is being met, right? They're just killing them so that they can take their land.
Right, okay.
Though in the Americas, people like did try to enslave Native Americans at various points, and it was like relatively unsuccessful. So it's not that they also tried to do slavery with them based on race. Yay. The history of my country. All right, so let's talk about the last part, messing with markers. So I argued in like the first lecture, I was like, when you have markers, you're gonna get inequity. It's this very kind of stable logic that these evolutionary systems push you towards. And now I'm like, you're also gonna get the markers. So if cultural markers themselves are chosen or evolve for the function of underpinning inequity, is there a way to resist this? Is there something to be done to stop that sort of process? So there's been like a lot of work in the social justice literature going back, I think, first to the 80s that argues that what we should do is try to eliminate or radically rework social categories like race and gender. So a lot of this has been written in the West, and so it's been focused on those categories. And the idea is that like if you can somehow remove these triggers for discrimination, these markers that lead to discriminatory behavior, then you can get rid of discrimination. And the models I've talked about suggest that that should work. If you don't have these tags, or if people don't use them to condition their behavior, you won't have inequity in these models. You need those two things in place to have inequity. So this argument kind of keeps coming up again and again. But then there's these sort of common responses to it. So one is that these are important identity categories to a lot of people. So a lot of people, especially when you talk about something like gender, like let's get rid of gender, a lot of people are like, hold on a second, I like my gender. It's part of my core identity. It's something I've been raised with, you know, it's meaningful to me. It has all these cultural meanings. There are a lot of, you know, sort of culturally important events where gender is playing a very crucial role. And so something is lost if we try to talk about eliminating these categories. Second, people point out that if you really could get rid of the recognition of these types of categories, you couldn't talk about unfairness in the past, right? So if you really became colorblind, you couldn't talk about racial injustice. If you became caste blind, you couldn't have rules that say people of certain castes can get certain jobs. So that might be an issue. And then the last point is like, this isn't really doable, you know? If we talk about gender, well, biological sex plays important organizing roles for things like romance, but also reproduction. We can't expect that we could just be like, we're in a totally genderless society floating free with none of these rules or meanings. So impractical and maybe not desirable for various reasons. So what we argue in the paper is that like, maybe we can have our cake and eat it too, where in these models, what we see is modest changes to the information content in these markers can help disrupt inequity. And so the idea is like, maybe you don't have to, you know, a lot of these proposals are like, let's eliminate this. Maybe you don't have to radically rework anything. Maybe you can make small changes at the margins to how much information your identity signals carry about either your group or the behavioral strategies you employ. And that maybe that can help do the job. And so these are models, so it's really an empirical question, like how much you have to change and to what degree to disrupt inequity. But we think that there's at least a serious possibility that like these more modest changes might reduce the power of these categories and tags and their markers. So maybe messing with identity signals can have real upshots for inequity. And in the paper, we point out that in the case of gender, that sort of seems like that's actually happening. Like we're in the middle of that process, that in a lot of places, people are messing with their gender signals and their gender identity and decorrelating a lot of the things that go together in the gender case. And it does seem to be playing a role in reducing gender inequity. And this is in line with some proposals, for example, by Appiah. In the case of race, he says, here's what we should do. We should live with fractured identities, engage in identity play, find solidarity with our racial groups, but recognize that they're contingent. And so what he means is like recognize that these things didn't have to be this way. You can enjoy your like ethnic identity, but don't try to hold to it in such a serious way that you give it force or power or something like that. And then Sally Haslanger, in the case of gender, says one can encourage the proliferation of sexual and reproductive options. And by this, she means something like you could have a bunch of different kind of gender roles without maintaining that we can eliminate all social implications of sex. So she's saying here, like, we don't have to get rid of everything, but we can play, we can try different stuff when it comes to gender. All right, so I'll summarize tags that are more flexible, less observable. Oh, sorry, I cut that part out. But we also look at heritability of tags in the models, which is like the degree to which when you pass them on, they remain identical, like to offspring. But tags with these properties are worse at supporting inequitable systems because they carry less information about group identity and expected behavior. For this reason, we see tags like race getting selected over cultural evolutionary time to underpin inequity. And last, playing with tags may be a successful way to undermine inequity, probably not on its own. So, you know, many people have pointed out that if you're in a highly oppressive system, it's not like you can just be like, I'm gonna do a really different gender thing or a really different class thing or whatever. People are gonna shove you back into place because maintaining correct tag markers is an important part of those systems. So you often need to be changing things like laws or how much money people have or a lot of different things to get to a point where people can even start messing with markers. All right, and that's everything that I've got. Uh-oh.
It's a little big picture-ish question.
Yeah.
I wanted to know that when I look at cultural evolution and all that, in many of the cases, I could see it more asexual than sexual transmission. Then culture would be very close by, so I could have cloud of variants. Mutation rates would be higher compared to genetic. But
Depending on the situation, yeah.
All these three criteria are also in genetic evolution, which is under the name of quasi-species evolution. But is there any concept of cultural quasi-species kind of model you know?
I don't know about quasi-species evolution. So what is that idea?
So that's basically many variants of mutants are close by. They're always like cloud of mutants together, which are evolving.
Okay.
Not quite a single one. It happens more with viruses and all.
Yeah. Okay, so not knowing that much about the theory, like, I don't know how it would or wouldn't translate.
But you have not heard this jargon.
No, I haven't heard that jargon. It sounds kind of interesting. I will say about cultural evolution, though, that like a lot of people have tried to unify cultural evolutionary theory to be like, I'm going to give a grand unified cultural evolutionary theory. It never works because cultural evolution isn't like cultural evolution. There's just too many different ways that cultural change happens and too many different types of processes that go into the overall type of cultural change. So I think the right approach in general is to have many different models and theories about different areas of cultural change. So like when you're talking about technological change over time, you want a really different model than something like this, which is about interactive strategies changing. But, you know, if you look at like how instruments went from having like the hole that the music comes out being round to being like a half moon to being like a C to being an S, it's a totally different process, right? So it might be that like this kind of model is great for some things, this kind of model is great for other things, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I was wondering, there's an argument in my head, but I'm not sure if it's a good argument, but I was almost thinking, can we look at the response of the oppressive system as evidence of whether or not this sort of play would, would be something which can disrupt inequity. For example, in India, at least, intercaste marriages are still looked at as a very, they don't happen very often because of norms and, structures that are put into place. But if, which, I would say you could argue is the system trying to keep these tags and keep them, in place so that you can continue discrimination, which means that if you were to, in fact, have more intercaste marriage or any other things which disrupts this tag, you would go towards a more equitable system. Would you say that's a fair argument?
I would say that's probably a fair argument without knowing all the details of the case. But I think you see across many, many societies cases where rigid categories are created by cultural rules and they're held in place by those rules. And the reason is that if they're not held in place, the dissolution will lead to a dissolution of these organizing inequitable systems. And I suspect probably something similar is happening there. I mean, in the case like of race in the Americas, before you start having like interracial marriage, or in the case of slave owners, like rape of slaves and then mixed race children, before that you have like kind of clear racial markers, but then you have this confusion, like racial ambiguity, and then something like the one-drop rule is a specific policy that resolves the confusion. And although it's not legally in place, it's socially in place today in the US. So someone who is Black at all is still considered Black, which is weird, right? But it's still an organizing rule that then helps people decide how to treat people racially. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So a friend of mine from way back when, she explicitly called herself a mulatto.
Yeah.
She Caribbean heritage, but that is not the type of terminology that spread. Whereas the kind of American way of looking at things, the American tags have spread. So you've got almost, well, leakage of tags across systems, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. So like a kind of
anyway, I haven't got anything to say. What you thought about that?
Yeah, like the detailed rules of which tags count as what can culturally spread on their own as well. Yeah, that's certainly right. And I'm sure it happens all the time that those cultural rules get pushed into different cultures and kicked around and things.
Actually, that just reminds me, there's that Rammstein song, isn't there? That We All Live in America, which I suppose is about this phenomenon.
Yeah, hopefully everyone can escape now.
Metal.
I don't think anyone should want to. Yeah.
So I was thinking that another way of breaking down the system, apart from mixing up the signals, could be actually to choose a very strong signal and then disrupt the correlation between the signal and the power, basically. So that seems pretty obvious. So if you have people of one race having the same power as white people, then I guess, does it work the same, or is there a reason to prefer one over the other?
Yeah, good. So, right, like one thing we have here is that these rules work because you can observe these tags. But if you had tags that developed some unequal system around them, and then whoever's getting less, you start having this group experience them as demanding more, you should expect cultural evolution, right? And so there's different ways that could happen. I think the most important thing is a new association between that tag and like aggressive demands, like being pushy enough that you'll ruin the bargain and make this side have to concede to some degree. So people have pointed out to me, and I thought this was really interesting, but haven't modeled it, that like, if we're thinking about cultural evolution in all of these cases, cultural evolution happens via interpersonal interaction. It also happens though via like media communication. Like I can learn new expectations about a group of people who I've never met before by seeing like images or videos or reports of how they've interacted with others or them being high power. And so it might be that like that's another way to disrupt inequitable systems by showing traditionally low status groups getting more or having more power or whatever it is.
So I was just curious. So where do you position, or what's like what would you have for commenting on the so-called egalitarian societies then in Scandinavia and so?
Like, so my understanding is that a number of Scandinavian countries still are kind of like racist and outgroup biased, no?
Outgroup, yes.
Oh,
then you would say
egalitarian
within, right?
there.
Yeah, I mean, outgroup, yeah, that's a whole different,
Yeah.
because then the follow-up question would have been, what do you think about the hierarchy of tags? Because then that would be a hierarchy of tags within and outside, but at least within then.
At least within. Well, I mean, like, I guess part of the story here is like if you actually can perceive everyone as part of the same group, it's easy to get equity. Equity is what you should get, you know? I think like when you're talking about inequity, it becomes hard when you have instances of like true multicultural societies or a lot of interaction between groups that perceive each other as outgrouped. Like, yeah, if Scandinavia like remains like racially not that mixed, like easy for them, you know, hard for Brazil. Yeah.
Case I would think of like more gender.
Yeah.
And that's why I was thinking of, but
Oh, I
more or
see.
less then what I was trying to get at is, okay, we have been talking about tags and all, but what about the underlying bargaining game? I mean, does that go away then at some point if you try to look at resources or things like that?
Yeah, I guess like you could certainly imagine cultural systems where you've set things up in such a way that everyone is like so fine, like getting so many resources that bargaining doesn't matter as much. But my sense is that like it's kind of the instinct of humans to want stuff and to want more and also to want to do better than others. Like even if your whole culture is doing well, people still want more. And so my sense is that like dynamics around bargaining and resource division probably it would be very hard to make them totally go away in a human group. It's interesting though.
The end, you had these two individuals who had offered possible solutions. And the first one was something like, if you, right, so just, we can have ethnic identities, but we probably should like sort of stick to them less strictly than we currently already are.
Yeah.
And this sounded very similar to an argument I had heard about against cultural appropriation once, where an individual said that, oh, Asian cultures are far more sensitive about their cultural artifacts, which is why we sort of have to be way more careful when we use them. And if they were, you know, a little bit more easygoing with stuff like that, there wouldn't have been a problem in the first place. Sort of putting the onus of the cultural appropriation on the ones who need to get less, you know, strict with their cultural artifacts. But then there is already a cultural divide saying that the way Europeans do it, because we have gotten less sensitive about our cultural artifacts, this is the way to solve this problem, is you also follow our lead, which is very colonial of a mindset in my feeling. So, I mean, ethnic identities in Asia make a very important part of their, you know, identities. It's not a very straightforward solution of just like, oh, if you're just a little bit less sensitive about it, it will be better for all of us.
Well, I think there's sort of like cross-cutting like arguments sort of for and against these things. Like people, you know, I think the main places where people are really worried about cultural appropriation is when a powerful culture appropriates things from a less powerful culture and then uses it to make more money or get good things for themselves, right? Like when you take that culture and then by dint of your social position, use it to get more. So like If I go to a tiny village in Africa and I copy their painting and I take it back to my wealthy country and then sell their painting, like that's the bad kind. But in general, there's lots of cases where you can culturally copy without it being the bad kind of cultural appropriation. And in those cases, I think the sort of argument would be like, yeah, you should want to do that. You should just fiddle around with your behaviors, the things that would mark you as part of a group, the things that like would be expected for your group, like play around if you want, do something else, you know?
Right. So the kind of cultural appropriation I also had in mind was sort of not treating the cultural artifacts the way they are originally treated in the culture they're from.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
something like taking a statue of Buddha and sort of like putting it in your toilet because you think it's cute there.
Yeah.
It's a deity from where it comes from and shouldn't be
Yeah.
placed there.
Yeah, I think like in general, we can say like we want identity play, but not for people to be disrespectful towards like religious iconography or other important cultural iconography or cultural practices at the same time.